Hi there, my name is Mason, and I'm a musician living in Seattle. Today, I'm here to talk to you about the techniques and tricks I use to make generative music in Ableton Live. Earlier this month, I played a long set of ambient generative music at an overnight show, letting 3 different pieces of music happen over my 80-minute time slot. In this video, I'll walk through my Ableton project and explain how I build simple and complex instruments and patterns with devices and plugins that come with Live Suite. Let's get started. Maybe you already know some things about generative music, but I'll give you a little refresher just in case. Generative music is a term used by Brian Eno to describe music which is ever different and changing, and that is created by a system. Use of the term has expanded to describe a much wider variety of music, from randomly generated music mixes, audio produced by combining multiple audio playback sources, live rule-based computer composition, and most recently, music produced through artificial intelligence and large language models. The music I make is only one system of making generative music. If you're more familiar with different musical concepts or different technologies, then you might enjoy creating your own exciting generative music system. Let's dig into my generative music system. I usually isolate each piece of generative music in its own Ableton project file. But for my performance, I wanted smooth and seamless transitions between pieces, so I combined 3 different projects into one giant project. I've grouped all of the MIDI instrument tracks for each piece of music together and routed them to unique return tracks for each song, which are all going to the master. I'll start by walking through the 2 instruments in my piece, Melody Terrain. The first thing I do when I'm making generative music in Live is to make one clip providing consistent MIDI pitch, whatever pitch you like. If you're making music in a certain key, maybe start with the root note of the key. I set this clip to loop, and any track that needs a source signal is routed to receive this constant signal as an input. In this project, this track is sending out a C3, and all of my MIDI instrument tracks are receiving the signal from this MIDI track as their source input. Now we can start working inside an instrument track. I'm going to start with a simple one. I use a lot of Ableton's stock MIDI devices to modify, prescribe, or randomize different musical parameters. I almost always start with an arpeggiator towards the beginning of my chain and set its rate parameter to whatever rhythm I want to subdivide. You can set steps and distance in the arpeggiator if you'd like, but I prefer to use random MIDI devices instead, because you can be a lot more specific with random devices. In this chain, I have one random device that usually moves the input pitch up 2 octaves, another that moves the pitch up anywhere from 1 to 24 half steps, and another that moves the pitch up or down anywhere from 1 to 24 half steps. With these devices, the output pitches could be up to 2 octaves lower or up to 6 octaves higher than the input pitch. After these random devices, I added some pitch devices to shift the range of the possible pitches and to limit the range a little bit. You can limit the range of output pitches by making the range parameter smaller, or by setting the lowest higher than the bottom of your pitch range. Here I've done both to cut my range from 8 octaves down to 5 octaves. I like to limit pitch range with these devices to generate rest and create rhythmic variety, but it's hard to hear in this very slow instrument. After the pitch devices, I've added a scale device to force input pitches into a major pentatonic scale with its root on F sharp, then a velocity device to limit and add variety and randomness to note velocity, and a note length device to make each note much longer than its original duration. With this MIDI device chain, I've transformed a constant input MIDI signal into a randomly generated assortment of pitches in F-sharp major pentatonic with long durations, each with their own randomly generated velocities, and also I've occasionally left some space. These notes are sent to a pretty simple wavetable instrument, 2 simple waveforms with a slow, small LFO on the filter frequency, running through an EQ, a compressor, a utility to compress width, and optional saturation. All of that processing sounds like this. Once you run that through some reverb, you've got a solid foundation of ambience and a tonal center to layer over. The only other instrument in this piece of music is a marimba patch with a signal chain like this. I started with an arpeggiator generating eighth notes, and then added my favorite random and pitch combo to generate rests. I think it's important to generate rests or limit incoming MIDI pitches before you do any other MIDI device processing, because you can save on some computing power by reducing the number of notes you're sending through the chain. This probably wouldn't be a very noticeable difference in CPU in the first instrument, but when you're generating faster rhythms, it can add up quickly. After I've done the limiting, I added a random to move the pitches around. From here, I had the idea to make a fun compound random delay device, letting the computer randomly decide which notes get which delay parameters. I started with a MIDI effect rack and made a chain with a random pitch combo to only allow 25% of the notes through. Then, those 25% of notes hit a note echo device that reproduces the MIDI signal at a defined interval. Then I duplicated this small chain 3 times to make 4 random to pitch to note echo chains, each set to allow 25% of the notes through. Then I gave each note echo its own LFO to slightly modulate the delay time, and I specified unique delay times on each note echo so that each chain would have a different delay effect, and each incoming MIDI pitch would probably get its own unique delay time. Since all of the random devices are set to random mode and not alt mode, each pitch that goes into the MIDI effect rack could be passed through to any of the 4 different note echoes. It could be passed to multiple note echoes at the same time, or all of them at once, or none of them at all. This complex MIDI signal chain is sent to a marimba instrument with its own built-in EQ, and is then sent through an audio delay and a compressor just to make a giant compressed wall of sound of marimba notes. Altogether, it sounds like this. And with the drony instrument, it sounds like this. That's all that I programmed for Melody Terrain. Let's move on to the next piece, Industrial Oasis. Industrial Oasis is 4 instruments: a bowed vibraphone, a bansuri flute, Zen bowls from the mood reel pack, and a Wavetable bass patch. I've already covered the simple processing in the vibraphone MIDI chain, and I like to play the bass in real time, so I won't talk about those 2. But there's some fun programming in the other 2 instruments. Let's start with the bowls. The MIDI chain for the bowls starts with a simple pitch device, which slightly raises the pitch of the incoming signal, and an arpeggiator with an LFO on the rate, set to slowly and slightly increase or decrease the note frequency. I have a pitch random combo that only allows 30% of incoming pitches through, then another pitch device to raise the pitch between 1 and 12 half steps. From here, I thought it might be nice to hear some harmony. So far I've just been generating individual pitches, so I added a chord device to generate another pitch. But I didn't want to hear the same interval every time, so instead of using one chord device, I made a MIDI effect rack with 13 different chord devices, set to different intervals and unique input MIDI pitches. The MIDI pitches that come into the MIDI effect rack determine which chord device will be used and which interval you'll hear. I added another random device after the MIDI effect rack, so you don't hear the same interval on the same note every time. Then I limited the range with a pitch device and forced all of the pitches into E major with a scale device. This complex MIDI signal chain is sent to the Zen bowl instrument with just a bit of additional signal processing, and it sounds like this. really like the variety that all of the chord devices add, so I experimented with something similar for the bansuri instrument. This MIDI signal chain starts with an arpeggiator generating long notes, which are randomly pitch shifted up or down in a small range with a random device, then forced into E major with a scale device. At this point, I added a MIDI effect rack to create something similar to the Bowles MIDI effect rack. For each incoming MIDI pitch, there's a specific chord effect that adds anywhere from 3 to 6 additional pitches. These whole note chords are then sent through an arpeggiator set to up and down, with an LFO on the rate, turning chords into fast-flowing streams of notes. I also added another random device with a small percentage just to add a little spice, and then ran the signal through the bansuri instrument and through an EQ, a little saturation, a delay, and a medium hall reverb. All of that sounds like this. Then everything together with the vibraphone and the bass sounds like this. That's it for Industrial Oasis. Let's move on to the last track, Stargazing. Now that I've talked about a few of my MIDI effect rack tricks and simple concepts, I've already covered most of what's happening here in Stargazing. The 2 guitar tracks are using MIDI devices in the simpler ways that I've previously described, and their group has an audio effect track with 2 different delays, one set to 3 and 5/16ths, and the other set to a time interval that I can control with an external knob. The MIDI signal chain in the chords track in Stargazing has another MIDI effect rack doing some compound random stuff. In this instance, I'm using small MIDI effect chains to randomly generate additional pitches at predetermined intervals with chord devices. In this chain, for example, 65% of the time, another pitch 7 half steps higher is generated along with the original pitch. Each chain is set to a different percentage and a different interval, and one chain is empty so that the original pitch can always pass through. This effect rack will sometimes produce full 4-note chords, sometimes triads, sometimes thirds, fifth, or octaves, or other times just the original input pitch. Once the MIDI signal goes through the instrument and its audio effects, it sounds like this. There's one more MIDI effect rack trick inside the electric piano MIDI signal chain. After generating whole notes in a wide range of pitches and only allowing a small range of them to pass through. Input pitches hit a MIDI effect rack with 3 different chains. Each chain in the effect rack contains a note echo set to a different rhythmic subdivision, 3, 5, and 8. And each note echo gets its own LFO, which modulates the beat offset percentage to move rhythms off the grid in a varying amount. Each note produced from this effect rack hits 2 more random devices set to small percentages to occasionally shift the pitch before being sent to the EP instrument and its effects processing. It takes a while to hear the subtleties in the signal flow, but I'll let all of the instruments run together for a little bit. You might have noticed the pitch devices at the very beginning of all of the MIDI signal chains. I've placed them at the beginning of each chain to act as a sort of kill switch for incoming MIDI signal. I've set these devices to have a range of 0, so that when the device is on, no signal is allowed to pass through. I can turn these devices off when I want to send signal through the chain, but I'll turn them on when I'm playing a different piece of music. In this project, with 3 different pieces and a bunch of MIDI and audio effects, I wanted to make sure that I was conserving CPU by only sending MIDI signal through the instruments and effects I was actively using, only 3 or 4 at a time, instead of processing 10 instruments and all of their effects for the whole set. I like to stop sending signal through the chain as early in the chain as possible, so I include these kill switches instead of turning off the instrument or turning off the speaker. But I don't usually need to add these kill switches when I'm only running one piece of music in one project, because I'm not using as much CPU. Now that I've walked through most of my instruments and their MIDI effects chains, I've shared most of my processes, tips, and tricks for creating exciting and interesting generative music in Ableton Live. If you'd like to experiment with the signal flows in my project, or use my ideas as a starting point for your own musical ideas, feel free to download the project file from the link in the description. You might have to add your own MIDI instruments if you don't have all of the instruments that I'm using, but you'll still be able to hear all of the prescribed MIDI output with almost any instrument. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment and I'll do my best to get back to you. Thanks for watching.